The scream of brakes ripped through the icy Los Angeles air. Hollywood icon jolted in his seat, his gaze snapping to the chaos outside his car window. A woman collapsed onto the cracked pavement, her frail body trembling under a tattered blanket. Pedestrians hurried past, blind to her suffering, but Hollywood icon couldn't look away. His breath hitched. That face, hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, and a flicker of a memory. Mrs. Henderson. The name tore through him like a knife. His acting coach from his early days in Toronto, the woman who'd once lit a fire of ambition in him, now shivered on the concrete, forgotten. "Sir, the light's green," the driver said. Hollywood icon's hands clenched. The car crept forward, but his eyes stayed locked on her. One wrong move, and she'd disappear into the crowd forever. "Stop the car!" he barked. Tires screeched. Horns blared behind them, but Hollywood icon was already throwing open the door. Cold wind stung his face as he stepped onto the sidewalk, his boots crunching against the grime. Every instinct screamed to turn back, to retreat into his quiet, private world. But guilt anchored him in place. How had she fallen this far? He knelt beside her, his voice barely steady. "Mrs. Henderson." She lifted her head. For a heartbeat, her eyes were vacant. Then recognition shattered her despair. "Hollywood icon?" Her whisper shattered him. Saving her could unravel his life, but walking away would destroy them both. Hollywood icon's eyes remained locked on the woman as the car began to move. His heart pounded, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. He leaned forward, craning his neck for a better look, ignoring the honk of a car behind him. The memory tugging at him refused to take shape, but the nagging familiarity wouldn't let go. "Stop the car," Hollywood icon said, his voice sharper than he intended. The driver hesitated but complied, pulling over to the curb. Hollywood icon's breath was shallow as he pushed the door open and stepped onto the icy sidewalk. His boots made a jarring contrast against the grimy pavement. As he moved closer, the city's sounds faded into the background. The woman huddled against the side of a building, shielding herself from the cold wind that seemed determined to claim her. Her hands trembled as she clutched the thin blanket tighter, and Hollywood icon could see her shoulders shaking. He stopped just a few steps away, frozen by the sudden realization that hit him like a lightning bolt. His knees felt weak, and his throat tightened. It was her, Mrs. Henderson. His mind raced back to his 20s, to her cramped studio apartment where she drilled him on Shakespeare and Beckett. She had been his mentor, the one who saw raw talent in him when he was just another struggling actor. She had believed in him, inspired him to dig deeper, and taught him more than any script ever could. How could someone so strong, so full of life, end up here? The thought was unbearable. Hollywood icon's stomach churned as guilt and disbelief swirled inside him. He couldn't reconcile the image of the vibrant, passionate woman he remembered with the fragile figure before him. Every fiber of his being wanted to turn away, to return to the solitude of his world where problems like hers didn't exist. But something deeper, something stronger, anchored him in place. He cleared his throat, trying to summon the courage to speak. "Mrs. Henderson?" The words came out barely above a whisper. The woman flinched and slowly lifted her head. Her hollow eyes, once so full of wisdom and kindness, met his. For a moment, there was no recognition, only exhaustion and pain. Then, as if a veil lifted, her expression shifted. Her lips parted, and a faint trembling whisper escaped. "Hollywood icon?" Hearing her say his name shattered something inside him. She instinctively tried to smooth her disheveled hair, hide her dirty hands, as though she could erase what she had become. But there was no hiding it. Shame flickered across her face. Hollywood icon knelt down, his voice trembling. "It's me. I'm here." He wanted to say more, to reassure her, but the lump in his throat stopped him. Mrs. Henderson's eyes welled up with tears, her pain visible in every tear that fell. Hollywood icon stayed frozen, his mind torn in a battle he never expected. The voice in his head screamed for him to walk away, to get back in the car and leave this nightmare behind. She was a part of his past, not his present. What could he possibly do to fix this? But then another voice, quieter but stronger, cut through his hesitation. It reminded him of the woman he used to know, the one who never gave up on her students, the one who taught him to channel pain into art. The image of her encouraging him through his first audition haunted him, pushing him to act. He stood up slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. His gaze shifted from her trembling figure to the bustling streets around them. People walked past without a second glance, their faces blank, their eyes avoiding the scene entirely. It was as though she was invisible to the world. Hollywood icon clenched his fists, frustration bubbling inside him. How had it come to this? How could someone who gave so much to others be abandoned like this? He looked back at Mrs. Henderson, still sitting there, her shoulders slumped in defeat. He took a step closer. The cold wind bit at his face, but he barely noticed. His voice wavered, but his determination didn't. "Mrs. Henderson, let me help you." She didn't respond at first, just stared at the ground as though she hadn't heard him. Shame and disbelief were etched into every line of her face. Hollywood icon's heart twisted at the sight. He crouched down again, his voice firm yet gentle. "You helped me when I needed it most. Please, let me do the same for you." Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she shook her head weakly. "No one can help me now," she whispered, her voice so faint it almost disappeared in the wind. Hollywood icon swallowed hard. "I'm not leaving without you." For a long moment, there was silence between them. Then slowly, Mrs. Henderson looked up at him, her eyes filled with something he hadn't seen before, a flicker of hope. The tension in the air felt like a weight pressing down on Hollywood icon as he helped Mrs. Henderson to her feet. Her frail body wavered, and for a moment, he thought she might collapse. He steadied her gently, his hands firm but careful, aware of how fragile she had become. "I don't belong anywhere, Hollywood icon," she murmured, her voice shaking. Her words cut through him like a knife, but he didn't let go. The sounds of the bustling street seemed far away now, muted against the pounding of his heart. "You belong somewhere safe," he replied firmly, trying to keep his voice steady. "And I'm taking you there." People on the sidewalk began to notice. Their curious glances and hushed whispers irritated Hollywood icon, but he ignored them. A man in a suit glanced over, shaking his head as though silently disapproving. A woman across the street muttered something to her companion, her gaze fixed on Mrs. Henderson's disheveled appearance. Hollywood icon's jaw tightened, anger rising in his chest. How could they judge so easily? None of them knew her story, the battles she'd fought, or the sacrifices she had made. To them, she was just another forgotten face on the streets of Los Angeles. But to him, she was a hero, a woman who once gave everything to shape young artists. Mrs. Henderson tried to pull away. "Please, Hollywood icon, don't. People are staring." "Let them stare," he said sharply, his tone leaving no room for argument. "They don't matter." Her resistance faltered, but the shame on her face deepened. "I don't want you to see me like this," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I don't want anyone to see me." Hollywood icon knelt down, meeting her eyes. "I see you for who you are, not what the world has done to you." Tears welled up in her hollow eyes, and she looked away, unable to hold his gaze. Hollywood icon's chest tightened. He wanted to shake her, to tell her she was worth saving, but he knew words wouldn't be enough. She had spent years being invisible, ignored by a society that dismissed her as nothing more than a burden. The driver stepped out of the car hesitantly, holding the door open. "Sir, should I—" "Yes," Hollywood icon snapped, not even glancing back. He reached for Mrs. Henderson's hand again. "Please trust me," he said, his voice softer now. Her hand trembled as she hesitated. The doubt in her eyes was unmistakable, but so was the flicker of something else. Something fragile but alive. Hope. Slowly she placed her hand in his, the small gesture feeling monumental in its weight. Hollywood icon helped her into the car, ignoring the stares and whispers around them. Once inside, the silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. Mrs. Henderson glanced around, her sunken eyes taking in the car's modest interior. Her frail fingers brushed against the window, as if the warmth of the car felt foreign to her. "I don't deserve this," she muttered under her breath. Hollywood icon's gaze hardened. "You deserve so much more." Her lips trembled as she tried to form words but couldn't. Hollywood icon leaned back in his seat, his hands gripping his knees. His mind raced as he planned his next steps. The confrontation on the sidewalk was over, but a much larger battle was just beginning. As the car glided through the city streets, Mrs. Henderson sat in silence, her eyes fixed on the passing world outside. The warmth of the vehicle seemed to thaw something inside her, but the weight of her circumstances was still heavy. Hollywood Icon stole a glance at her, his chest tightening at how frail and defeated she looked. Finally, he broke the silence. "Mrs. Henderson, what happened?" She hesitated, her hands twisting the edge of the blanket she still clutched. "It's a long story," she murmured, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "I have time," Hollywood Icon replied, his tone gentle but firm. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering the strength to speak. When she began, her voice was barely above a whisper, but every word carried the weight of years of pain. "I was a teacher," she started, a faint trace of pride flickering in her voice. "Not just a job, it was who I was. I loved it. I loved shaping young minds, watching my students grow, and seeing the light in their eyes when they understood something new. It was my purpose." Her gaze dropped to her lap. "But life doesn't care about purpose. First it was the diagnosis. I thought I could fight it. I thought I could keep teaching. But the illness took everything. My energy, my strength, my ability to stand in front of a classroom." Hollywood Icon listened intently, his hands gripping the edge of his seat. The pain in her voice was almost unbearable. "And then," she continued, her voice cracking, "my husband, he was my anchor. He was my everything. One day he was there, and the next he was gone. A heart attack, they said, quick and sudden. But it wasn't quick for me. It wasn't sudden. It was endless." She paused, her breath shaky. "I thought I'd still have my children. I raised them to be strong, to be kind. They promised me they'd take care of me. But promises fade when they're inconvenient. The calls became less frequent. Then they stopped altogether." Her hands trembled as she spoke, the memories clearly cutting deep. "When I couldn't keep up with the bills, I sold the house. I thought at least I'd have enough to survive. But the money went fast. Medical expenses, rent, food. And when I needed them most, my children weren't there." Hollywood Icon felt a lump rise in his throat, anger bubbling beneath the surface. How could anyone abandon her? She had given so much, and this was her reward. "I ended up in a shelter," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice hollow. "It was supposed to be temporary. I kept telling myself I'd find a way out. But shelters aren't safe, not for someone like me. The nights were filled with screams, fights, and fear. I held on as long as I could, but then the fire—" She trailed off, her eyes distant. "The fire took what little I had left, my documents, photos, clothes, everything. After that, I ended up on the streets. And there I stayed, day after day, night after night, wondering how I became this." Hollywood Icon clenched his fists, his knuckles white. Her story was a nightmare, but what struck him most was the way she told it, not with bitterness, but with a quiet, resigned sorrow. "I never thought anyone would see me again," she finished, her voice barely audible. "Not like this." Hollywood Icon leaned forward, his voice thick with emotion. "Mrs. Henderson, I see you, and I promise, you're not invisible. Not anymore." For the first time she turned to him, her eyes glistening with tears. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why would you care?" Hollywood Icon's reply was simple but unwavering. "Because you cared about me when no one else did. Now it's my turn." The car ride continued in silence, but Hollywood Icon's mind was anything but quiet. Mrs. Henderson's story echoed in his thoughts, each word a painful reminder of how cruel life could be. He couldn't stop replaying the images she painted, her descent from a respected teacher to a forgotten face on the streets. It wasn't just heartbreaking, it was infuriating. As they neared the city's quieter district, Hollywood Icon made a decision. No, it wasn't just a decision, it was a vow. He wasn't going to let her return to that life, not if he could do something about it. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw set in determination. He pulled out his phone and began making calls. "I need a room. Something simple with privacy," he said to the first person on the line. His voice was sharp and authoritative, leaving no room for negotiation. Mrs. Henderson watched him with a mix of confusion and disbelief. Hollywood icon, you don't have to. Yes, I do, he interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. You've been through enough. Let me do this for you. She didn't argue further, but the hesitation in her eyes was clear. Hollywood icon understood. She'd been let down so many times before that trusting someone now felt impossible. He would have to prove to her that this time was different. The car stopped in front of a modest hotel, its clean facade unassuming. Hollywood icon stepped out first, opening the door for Mrs. Henderson. She froze, her eyes darting between him and the building. I can't go in there, she whispered, her voice shaking. I don't belong. You belong where you're treated with respect, Hollywood icon said firmly, extending his hand to her. And I won't take no for an answer. Reluctantly, she took his hand, her fingers trembling in his. Together, they walked through the hotel's doors. The warmth inside was a stark contrast to the biting cold they had just left behind. Heads turned as they passed, a mix of curiosity and judgment etched on the faces of the hotel staff and guests. Hollywood icon ignored them, his focus solely on Mrs. Henderson. At the front desk, he didn't waste time. A room, please, he said, sliding his card across the counter. The receptionist blinked in surprise but quickly complied. Mrs. Henderson clutched the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her gaze fixed on the polished floor. This feels wrong, she muttered. Hollywood icon turned to her, his expression softening. This isn't wrong. What happened to you was wrong. Let me help make it right. The elevator ride to the third floor was quiet, except for the faint hum of the motor. Mrs. Henderson stood in the corner, clutching her blanket as though it were armor. Hollywood icon stood beside her, his presence steadying. When the doors opened, they stepped into a simple hallway. Hollywood icon slid the keycard in, and the lock clicked open. He pushed the door wide, revealing a room that was clean and comfortable. A large window offered a view of the city's skyline, and a tray of fresh fruit sat on a small table. Mrs. Henderson hesitated on the threshold. I can't, she began, her voice trembling. Hollywood icon turned to her, his expression firm but kind. You can and you will. This is where you belong tonight. Reluctantly, she stepped inside, her movements hesitant. The warmth of the room enveloped her, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel the biting cold. She ran her fingers along the edge of the bed, the softness unfamiliar and almost overwhelming. There's a hot shower waiting for you, Hollywood icon said, gesturing toward the bathroom. Fresh clothes too? Take your time. Her eyes darted between him and the bathroom door. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice barely audible. Because you deserve it, Hollywood icon replied simply, and because I owe you more than I can ever repay. She didn't respond, but her eyes filled with tears. Without another word, she stepped into the bathroom and closed the door behind her. Hollywood icon sank into a chair, running his hands through his hair. The weight of her story still hung heavily on him, but for the first time that day, he felt a glimmer of relief. Minutes turned into an hour, and when Mrs. Henderson finally emerged, she was transformed. Her hair was clean and neatly brushed, and she wore a simple sweater and pants. The years of hardship were still etched into her face, but there was a new light in her eyes, a spark of dignity that had been missing. She hesitated at the doorway, her hands clutching the edges of the sweater. I don't know how to thank you, she said softly. Hollywood icon stood and smiled. You don't have to. Just know this isn't the end. It's the beginning. They sat together at the small table, sharing the meal that had been delivered while she was bathing. For the first time in years, she ate without fear of where her next meal would come from. Every bite seemed to restore a piece of her that had been lost. As the night wore on, Mrs. Henderson began to speak. The words came slowly at first, but soon she opened up about the small joys she used to cherish. Her love for teaching, her late husband's laugh, the pride she felt in her children before everything fell apart. Hollywood icon listened, nodding and encouraging her to continue. You're not invisible anymore, he said finally, his voice steady. Not to me and not to the world. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but for the first time, they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of hope. The next morning, Hollywood icon was already on the phone before the sunlight filtered through the hotel curtains. His tone was sharp, commanding, and unwavering as he navigated the labyrinth of bureaucracy to get Mrs. Henderson the help she needed. Every call he made was a step closer to restoring her life. "Medical care is non-negotiable," he said firmly to one contact. "I don't care about the waiting list. Find a way." Mrs. Henderson watched him from the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The room felt safe, almost unreal, and she couldn't shake the thought that all of this would disappear like a dream. She opened her mouth to speak but stopped, unsure of what to say. Hollywood icon glanced at her between calls. "Don't worry," he said gently. "I'm taking care of everything." His reassurance sounded so simple, but to Mrs. Henderson, it felt monumental. No one had spoken to her with such certainty in years. She sat silently as Hollywood icon continued to move mountains for her. By midday, he had arranged a series of appointments: a doctor to assess her health, a lawyer to handle paperwork for assistance programs, and a social worker to guide her through the steps of rebuilding her life. Each arrangement was another stone placed in the foundation of her future. Mrs. Henderson accompanied Hollywood icon to her first doctor's appointment that afternoon. The clinical environment was daunting, but Hollywood icon stayed by her side, offering quiet words of encouragement. When the doctor examined her frail body and discussed treatment options, Hollywood icon listened intently, nodding at every suggestion. "We'll do whatever it takes," he said. His determination left no room for doubt. Over the next several days, the pace didn't slow. Hollywood icon accompanied her to meetings, helped her fill out forms, and even stayed late at night researching resources that could offer her long-term support. He seemed tireless, driven by a sense of purpose that left Mrs. Henderson in awe. But it wasn't just the logistics he focused on. Hollywood icon knew her spirit needed rebuilding just as much as her circumstances did. One afternoon, he handed her a stack of old scripts and a notebook. She stared at them, her hands trembling. "I thought you might want to get back to teaching," he said, his voice soft but filled with meaning. "Maybe not in a classroom, but there are kids out there who need someone like you." Mrs. Henderson's eyes welled up as she ran her fingers over the scripts. "I haven't held a script in years," she whispered. "I thought that part of my life was over." "It's not over," Hollywood icon said firmly. "You still have so much to give." It was a turning point. Slowly, Mrs. Henderson began to believe that she could have a future. She started attending community programs where she could mentor aspiring actors. The first time she stepped in front of a group of young students, her hands shook. But as she began to speak, something shifted. The teacher she once was began to reemerge. Hollywood icon was there to witness her transformation. He watched as she spoke to the students, her voice gaining strength with every word. She no longer seemed like the frail, defeated woman he had found on the streets. She was Mrs. Henderson again, a teacher, a mentor, and a beacon of hope. "You're amazing," Hollywood icon told her after one session. "I always knew you were." Mrs. Henderson smiled, her eyes shining. "I couldn't have done this without you." "You did this," Hollywood icon replied. "I just gave you a push." Weeks had passed, and Mrs. Henderson was no longer the fragile figure Hollywood icon had found huddled on a sidewalk. She stood taller now, her movements steadier, and her eyes carried a quiet confidence that had been missing for years. Hollywood icon couldn't help but feel a swell of pride every time he saw her smile. One morning, Mrs. Henderson entered the community center with a box of scripts tucked under her arm. The small classroom was filled with eager faces, young actors from underprivileged backgrounds who had already begun to look up to her. The room was simple, with worn chairs and a whiteboard, but it was enough. She placed the box on the desk and pulled out a script. Holding it in her hand felt like holding a part of herself she thought she had lost forever. As she turned to face the students, a nervous energy coursed through her, but it quickly faded when she saw their curious eyes. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady and warm. "Good morning, Miss Henderson," they chimed back in unison. A small, genuine smile broke across her face. It was the kind of smile Hollywood icon hadn't seen in years. From the back of the room, he watched quietly, his arms crossed and his heart full. This was the Mrs. Henderson he remembered, the one who had inspired him and so many others. The lesson began, and the students leaned forward, captivated by her every word. She wasn't just teaching them acting techniques, she was teaching them hope, resilience, and the belief that they could rise above their circumstances. It was as though she had been reborn in that classroom, her purpose reignited. When the session ended, one of the students lingered behind. A shy teenager approached Mrs. Henderson, clutching a worn notebook to his chest. "Miss Henderson," he said softly, "I want to be an actor, just like you taught Mr. Reeves." The words hit Mrs. Henderson with unexpected force. Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of joy. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You can be anything you want to be," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "And I'll help you get there." Hollywood icon waited outside as Mrs. Henderson said goodbye to the last of the students. When she finally emerged, she looked like a new person. Her steps were lighter, her shoulders no longer burdened by the weight of the past. "I saw you in there," Hollywood icon said with a grin. "You haven't lost your touch." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "It feels good. It feels right." Hollywood icon nodded. "That's because it is." They walked together in silence for a moment, the sun shining warmly on their faces. Mrs. Henderson glanced over at him. "Hollywood icon, I don't know how to thank you." "You already have," he replied simply. "Watching you today, that was thanks enough." The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of the community center as Hollywood icon sat on a bench outside, watching the students scatter with laughter and energy. Mrs. Henderson's voice still echoed in his mind, the way she had spoken to those kids, the hope she had instilled in them. It was a sight he would never forget. For years, Hollywood icon had lived in a world of scripts and premieres, a life untouched by the harsh realities so many endured. But that day on the streets had changed everything. Seeing Mrs. Henderson, once a pillar of strength and inspiration, reduced to a shadow of herself, had forced him to confront truths he had long ignored. He realized how fragile life could be, how quickly everything could be taken away. It wasn't just about fame or success, it was about resilience, compassion, and the strength to keep going when the world turned its back. Mrs. Henderson had taught him that lesson years ago, and now she was teaching him again. Hollywood icon leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his thoughts heavy but clear. Helping her hadn't just changed her life, it had changed his. It had reminded him of the power of kindness, the importance of giving back, and the strength found in human connection. As Mrs. Henderson stepped out of the community center, her face lit up with a smile. Hollywood icon knew he had made the right choice. This wasn't just her redemption, it was his too. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was living a life that mattered. The morning sun bathed the community center in a soft golden glow as Mrs. Henderson locked the door behind her. Her heart was light, her steps confident. She looked up at the clear sky, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Life had given her another chance, a chance to rebuild, to teach, to inspire. Hollywood icon stood nearby, leaning against his motorcycle, watching her with a quiet smile. He knew this was just the beginning. Helping her had been more than an act of kindness. It had been a reminder of what truly mattered. In a world filled with chaos and indifference, small actions could ripple into profound change. "This isn't goodbye, you know," Hollywood icon said as Mrs. Henderson approached him. "We're just getting started." She nodded, her smile soft but genuine. "I know, and I'm ready." As they drove away, the camera shifts its focus, showing the now vibrant community center and the students who ran inside with excitement. A faint echo of Mrs. Henderson's laughter filled the air.